Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at dwarfs in folklore. And we've got some really interesting academic excerpts that kind of turn some of the common ideas about dwarfs upside down. You might be surprised by what you learn today.
Yeah, one of the most interesting things is that the picture we have of dwarfs as short, that might not be as old as we think. In fact, if we look at some of the earliest sources, their size isn't even mentioned.
Really? So what do those early sources focus on? I've always pictured them as like, well, small.
It's fascinating, actually. The oldest texts, particularly Norse mythology, like the Eddas, these collections of poems and stories, they focus more on what dwarfs do rather than what they look like. It's their skills and actions that define them.
Okay, so let's unpack that. I do remember dwarfs being known for being incredible craftsmen, especially blacksmiths. They forged some pretty important stuff, right?
Absolutely. They made some of the most legendary items, like Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, and the magical necklace, Brisingamen, owned by Freyja. These were powerful and beautiful objects and really showed off the dwarf's incredible skill.
Those are some pretty amazing creations. It makes dwarfs seem really powerful, almost godlike. But it also makes me wonder, if they were making such powerful objects, what was their relationship with the gods really like? Like, were they equals?
That's a great question, and it brings up a really important point. See, the relationship between dwarfs and the gods wasn't always all that harmonious. In a lot of stories, dwarfs were actually forced to give up their creations to the gods, almost like they were being exploited for their
Is
skills.
that so different from the image of a friendly, helpful dwarf? It sounds like their relationship with the gods was way more complicated than we might think.
Exactly, and it's completely different from how elves are portrayed. Elves often had much more positive relationships with the gods, engaging in trade and exchanges, not forced servitude.
So would you say dwarfs were seen as kind of antisocial, even rebellious, compared to elves?
You could definitely see that in some of the stories. Sometimes they're even linked to illness and misfortune. And then there's this recurring idea of dwarfs living, get this, inside stones, which sets them apart from other beings in Norse mythology.
Inside stones. Well, that's a bit creepy. Makes you think of these mysterious ancient beings hiding beneath the surface. It definitely challenges our modern ideas of dwarfs.
It really is striking, and it highlights how mysterious dwarfs are. It really blurs the lines between being and object. And this idea, it wasn't just in myths and legends. There's this chambered tomb in Orkney called the Dwarfy Stane that people believed was a dwarf's dwelling.
Wow, that's wild. It makes you wonder how much of these old beliefs came from real-world places. But today, we tend to think of dwarfs living in mountains, especially with the influence of modern fantasy like Tolkien. It seems like our understanding of them has changed over time.
You're right, the image of dwarfs in mountains is deeply embedded in our minds now. But even with that change, the main theme remains. Dwarfs are creatures of the underground, of hidden places, whether it's a mountain or a single stone.
So we have this mix of old and new interpretations shaping how we see dwarfs. But what about female dwarfs? Were they smiths or stone dwellers too? Did these early stories even mention them?
That's another fascinating part. Early sources almost exclusively talk about male dwarfs. It's not until later sagas and folktales that we see female dwarfs appearing.
Yeah, it really is. It's like they existed but were hidden somehow, at least not in the same way as the males. I wonder why that is.
It makes you think, right? Do we have any theories as to why that might be?
Well, you know those early stories like the Dvergadal, that list of dwarf names? They mainly mentioned male dwarfs. But there are hints that female dwarfs did exist. Like, for example, this inscription on a skull fragment. It's from the 8th century, and scholars think it was a charm to protect against a harmful female dwarf. A charm to protect against a dwarf, so people were actually afraid of them. What could have caused that?
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Maybe they were connected to certain types of magic or powers that people saw as dangerous, or it could be that their roles in dwarf society were just, less obvious to outsiders. So there's that sense of mystery, maybe even a bit of a threat.
Okay, so we have these hints of female dwarfs lurking around, maybe with powerful magic. But when do we actually see them as characters in the stories?
It's not until the later sagas that we see them come out of the shadows, like in the Givens saga or the Bosa saga. But even then, they're usually mentioned alongside male dwarfs. Not really as central figures, although there's one big exception, Harrier.
Who's that? I don't recognize that name.
She's the daughter of the famous dwarf smith Sindri. She appears in Horstein's saga, Viking Sonar, and she actually plays a pretty important role.
So it seems like female dwarfs slowly become more important in the stories.
That's pretty cool. It's like our picture of dwarf society is constantly evolving, even within these ancient tales. We have these expert male craftsmen, then those kind of scary female dwarfs in the background, and then bam, families and even dwarf children. It's amazing.
You got it. It's like we're putting a puzzle together, but with some pieces missing. And we have to constantly change our idea of the whole picture as we find more pieces. And talking about families, those later sagas actually tell us a lot about how dwarfs raise their kids.
Oh, really? What was their parenting style like? Were they strict, protective?
Well, there are stories where humans meet dwarf children, and how they treat those kids determines if the dwarf parents bless or curse them. There's one saga where a man throws a rock at a dwarf child and breaks its jaw. Later, the child's father curses the man in a dream.
Yikes. Sounds like you don't want to mess with a dwarf parent. No, you really don't. But, there are also nice stories where people are kind to dwarf children and the parents reward them. There's one I really like where a human becomes really close to a dwarf and his son, almost like a foster family. It challenges that idea that dwarfs were always solitary or didn't like outsiders.
Ah, that's sweet. So they could actually form bonds with others. It seems like we're seeing a more complete picture of dwarf society now, with families, complex relationships, and even connections with other beings. But, I want to go back to their craft for a sec. We know they made legendary items for the gods, but was it always a fair trade? Like, did the gods do something in return?
Not really, and this is where things get interesting. See, in a lot of those Epic poems and stories, the treasures don't seem to be given freely or even traded. It's more like the gods forced the dwarfs to give them up. Remember how we talked about dwarfs being associated with bad luck and illness? Well, some scholars think that this taking of their creations was a key difference between them and elves, who, remember, had those more give-and-take relationships with the gods.
So it wasn't really a trade, more like, what, divine robbery?
Pretty much. It's a big difference. Elves get gifts and blessings. Dwarfs get, well, robbed of their skills and creations.
I wonder how the dwarfs felt about that. Were they angry at the gods for always taking advantage of them? Or were they proud of their work, even if it was taken?
That's a really good question. It makes you think about how the Norse people saw dwarfs. Did they think they were just lesser beings? Or was their place in the world more complicated?
It's amazing how these stories can make you think so much. They raise so many questions. But before we get too lost in speculation, maybe it's time we talked about one of the biggest things associated with dwarfs, their connection to the underground. We mentioned it earlier, but there's a lot more to discover.
For sure. The underground is almost like a symbol for dwarfs, and you see it everywhere, from ancient myths to fantasy books today.
All right, let's dive into that underground world then. When I think about it, I picture these massive caverns, full of glowing forges and piles of gold and jewels.
It's a powerful image, for sure, but the reality might be even more interesting. Remember how we were talking about that ambiguity in the early sources? Like, were dwarfs in the stones or were they part of the stones?
Oh, yeah, that was really something.
Yeah.
It really makes you question how we see the world,
Yeah,
blurring that line between being and object.
exactly. And it suggests this really deep connection between dwarfs and the earth itself. There's this old Norse poem, the Voluspa, and it describes dwarfs being born from the earth, like they're a natural force.
So they weren't just craftsmen, they were practically part of nature. That's a pretty amazing idea.
It is, and that connection shows up in different ways in the myths. Sometimes dwarfs are like masters of the rocks, moving through mountains easily. Other times they're drawn to specific stones, like that dwarfy stane. It was believed to be a tomb and a dwelling, remember?
It's like the earth itself is important to them, almost sacred. But why the underground? Why not the sky or the sea? What is it about those hidden places that people found so fascinating?
That's a good question. It makes you think about all the symbolism, right? The underground represents darkness, mystery, the unknown. It's both attractive and kind of scary at the same time.
Plus, don't forget all those hidden treasures they're known for. Maybe the underground represents secrets, things we can't see, which fits their role as keepers of knowledge and powerful objects.
I like that. It's like they embody those hidden mysteries, both literally and figuratively.
And maybe that's why they started being associated with mountains later on.
Yeah.
Mountains, like in Tolkien, become these big symbols of their connection to the earth, their strength.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's like the idea naturally evolved, adapting to new landscapes and stories, but keeping that core idea of hidden depths.
Wow, this has been amazing. We started with this basic idea of dwarfs, short and bearded craftsmen. Now we're talking about identity, power, and what's real. Dwarfs are a lot more complex than I thought.
It just shows you that even the things we think we know can surprise us. There's always more to learn, more to ask, more to think about.
So for our listeners who are hooked on dwarfs now, where should they go to learn more? What would you recommend?
I'd say go straight to the source. Read those Eddas and sagas. They're full of incredible stories about dwarfs and other mythical beings. It'll spark your imagination and give you a new appreciation for them.
Great advice. And remember, folklore is alive. It's meant to be questioned and debated and reinterpreted, so don't be afraid to challenge what you think you know about dwarfs or any mythical creature.
Exactly. Keep your minds open to all the wonders out there, the things we know and the things we don't. There's always something new waiting to be discovered.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our exploration of dwarfs. But we'll leave you with this. If dwarfs were first seen as more like spirits, connected to the earth, why do we see them as physical beings now? What does that tell us about how folklore changes over time?
That's a great question to think about. Thanks for joining us, everyone.